we've got a record attendance and registrations today. And we want to, and all of you are deep in the world of recruiting and TA and HR. And all of you have incredible insights. You have metrics. So not just, we hope we'll bring a lot of data and ideas to share with you, but my hope is that you'll also share with each other and with your questions, with your wisdom and the insights. So use the chat, use the Q&A, and tell us. Seems like we have a lot of people in Seattle today, though. So let's get to it. And today I'm very excited. I'm especially excited. We do these workshops every 3 to 4 weeks. And our goal with these workshops is to help TA teams use data and metrics to instrument their processes better, to become more data-driven, because we live in such interesting times. And today I'm really excited because I'm joined by my co-founder, Dr. Mariam Jahanshah. She's been living and breathing metrics for 10 years and in TA and passionately bringing science to recruiting. So thank you, Mariam, for gracing us today.
I'm not that kind of doctor, just for everyone else's sake, but I do dabble in medical questions occasionally because I can't help myself.
And from what I understand, when you're not dabbling in medical questions or TA metrics, you're also a part-time electrician?
Yes, I just love seeing how things work and how things kind of get put together in high stress, dangerous situations, I guess, in some cases, which is kind of what I think everyone else here does too.
If TA isn't stressful enough, clearly.
Yes. So tell me about croissant critics.
Oh, God, I live in New York City. I love croissants, and we're very fortunate. We actually have some really good croissants, and some really good French bakeries have opened up here. And so it gives me a chance to turn my nose up and say, this is not as authentic as I'd like it to be. But my new favorite is an everything croissant that has all the seasonings of an everything bagel on top of a croissant. It is delightful. But let's start with today's workshop. Today, our goal is to cover 3 ideas. I want to talk about how talent teams today are shifting from reporting to insights. And as you think about it, whether you're a recruiting leader, whether you're an employment brand, whether you're a recruiter, how do you start thinking forward thinking? How do you start going beyond reporting to start thinking about how can you change and act on the processes? The second thing we want to give you today are benchmarks. So much is changing. How are your benchmarks really working? And the third thing we're going to talk about is we're going to do a live diagnostic together. I'm going to take an example company, anonymous of course, and we're going to kind of go through their metrics together and see how we would diagnose it and how we would try to improve their recruiting process. And hopefully it's just an opportunity for us to kind of put ourselves in, to elevate ourselves and think about how these metrics interplay in terms of candidate experience, in terms of capacity planning, in terms of productivity. Let's get right to it. So Mariam, tell us a little bit about the metrics that we're dealing with.
Yeah, so I think everyone here who's a practitioner knows that what you're feeling is something that we've never felt before in terms of the labor market, in terms of recent history. And while you're sort of reading on the one level all of these, examples of layoffs and things like that happening in other sectors, and specifically in a lot of frontline work, where they're sort of suffering from candidate starvation issues as well. So there's a lot of volatility, and it is functional specific. And then we've also got this additional trend that's sort of happened recently in terms of the move towards hybrid roles. And one of the things that's very unusual now with hybrid roles is that they're now attracting more applicants. They're behaving much more like remote roles in terms of the applicant pools that you have to deal with, rather than on-site roles where you are typically often starved of candidates. So those two things are on one level like the sort of macro changes. But then on the other side of things, we all know that, you might have more candidates, but everyone's TA teams are really, really lean, and there's a definite need to, do more with less. And that's probably one of the themes that we'll talk a lot more about today. The crutches that we used to use to get through sort of more tough periods in terms of labor markets were things like sourcing, and some of the impacts of AI and automation have caused those things to sort of change in terms of their ROI. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And lastly, when we have tight labor markets, it might feel like, you should be able to get candidates without any problem. But really, a strong employer brand does do a lot of the heavy lifting for teams. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that can contribute to metrics in a really quantitative way. So with that, I sort of wanted to talk about, we're going to be presenting a lot today. I just want to give everyone some context here that we want to keep this as interactive as possible. So throw your questions into chat. And we'll be sharing the deck and a cheat sheet after this. So feel free not to ask those questions because that'll all be shared in due course. And some part of what I wanted to sort of contextualize is that the things that used to work in 2021, in 2022, and 2023 are probably not working for you now in the same way that they do. And that's kind of why we want to contextualize this conversation a little bit. So we've all got capacity issues, and I think that's pretty much, and hopefully those in the chat are sort of talking a little bit about those. And we all want to sort of improve those. And I know there's been a strong trend towards automation systems and AI, and they're important goals. But one of the things that we see with, introducing any new technology is that the change management in your organization often takes a year for those to show up in your metrics. So many of you are faced with, hey, I've still got a massive set of action or tasks to be done on my plate. We have to hire really quickly. So what do you do now? And so one of the things that we've seen a lot with our customers is that there's often a lot of hidden capacity in your metrics. And sometimes it's about identifying and unearthing those bottlenecks so that you can start acting sooner. And so in that context, we're going to be presenting 2 metrics for each function within TA. And we'll be talking a little bit about what's a velocity metric and what's a reporting metric. And I'll have Amit sort of describe that.
And Miriam, you bring up such a really good point. Every single TA leader and TA team is thinking about how do we improve capacity. In fact, the metric used to be on average, let's have, a recruiter can fill typically 3 to 5 hires in a quarter. And we're starting to ask ourselves, how do we double that? And we're starting to look at all of these tools and AI, and we absolutely should, right? There's so many ways in which you can dramatically improve productivity. The problem with process changes, tool changes, is they can take a year, sometimes longer, depending on the size of your organization, to actually bear fruit, to get implemented, to kind of drive process. So the question Miriam and I tried to ask ourselves today was, as we're working through with many of our customers and many of you, we've seen through the data that data's always been neglected. And in your metrics often lies the ability to unlock 30, 40, 50% capacity right there, or at least be aware of where capacity bottlenecks happen. So that's where we want to get to today, is if we can turn, and so that's the idea I want to present to you, is historically, when we think about metrics, we've thought about metrics as reporting metrics. You report on SLAs, you report on your time to fill, you report on the hires you make. And for your reporting metrics, many of you typically go to your applicant tracking system, or you have, if you're a larger organization, you might have a BI tool or a Power BI dashboard or a Tableau dashboard where you're looking at these metrics. And that makes sense. I want to bring an argument here today. We're going to talk about those metrics are sometimes in the past, and they're very good to bring your full organization up to speed with the effectiveness of the recruiting function. But it's very hard for recruiting leaders and recruiting teams to operationalize what those metrics will look like 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now. So I want to bring up this idea that we're going to present to you today. That is, for every persona, we want to present to you a single velocity metric. A velocity metric that is a leading indicator. It's going to point you to where your reporting metric might be. And it's a metric that you should act on sooner, and you should make interventions on sooner. We'll talk about some of those interventions you can make. And the way we're going to talk about this is we're going to talk about this with different personas. Now, some of you are 1-person team, 5-person teams, 10-person teams, where you might wear many of these hats. And some of you are massive recruiting organizations where you've built out these functions. But one of the things that almost every organization today, recruiting organization today, you're thinking about typically about 6 to 7 different priorities. your priority as a group, your priority as a recruiter, your priority as a sourcer, your priorities in recruitment marketing, in talent attraction and inclusion. And so, but for each of these, rather than having a dozen metrics, what we want to show you is what is the one metric you're likely reporting on as your KPI, and what is your one metric that you should think about as a velocity metric to drive this process further. I'm going to pause here, and I asked a question on the chat. I said, how's your capacity? And it seems like every single person is, my God, we're stretched. We're stretched in management sales roles. We're stretched across. Whew. Mary, are you surprised by that?
No, not at all, because I think we've seen that impact on TA teams. We've seen their tech budgets cut as well. Literally everything that would be done to increase capacity is harder these days. So not surprised at all. And I wish it wasn't the case, but.
And the crazy part is some parts of your org are thinking, oh, hiring must be so easy. There's all these layoffs happening. Recruiting must have all the time in the world. Like, this is the best time to be a recruiter. And it is not. It is, in fact, we did a workshop, and we'll put the link here, a few weeks ago about the state of the labor markets. And we said one of the hardest things right now is it is the first time since I've been in the labor market, 25 years, that I remember where it was simultaneously both hard to hire and hard to get hired. It is so difficult. And a user rightly says capacity is misaligned. Poor forecasting and resources are trailing. So I'm going to ask the audience one more question to put in the chat. For those of you who are saying capacity is really stretched, what are you doing about it? What is the one tip you would give your peer, you'd give your fellow community here, that they could do today to alleviate that capacity problem? So let's share with each other. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and we'll amplify some of the good ones in the chat. So let's get to it. So at any moment of time, you're going to be wearing one of these hats. You're going to wear one of these hats. And our question is, when you're wearing that hat, which metric should you focus on? So let's start with the overall TA function. Let's start with that. And this is likely something that TA leaders and TA operations care about, but it's also something that every person in recruiting should care about, because we're all trying to align ourselves with our overall goals, with the goals of our teams. And so the thing on this, Miriam, would you like to tell us about time to fill?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is one of those things that I think both leaders and individual recruiters are sort of focused on. And you care about this. And the reason why time to fill is an important reporting metric is often you have SLAs with business units and different leaders. And they need to know that from when time they start their process, in the gambit of time, how long will it take for them to have someone in seat? And that's obviously really important for them to make their goals. And so this is often the type of reporting metric that you would give to your colleagues. And the typical benchmark for this is 45 to 60 days, even in this market. And some people have different ways in which they measure it. They might do an average or a median. And other sort of teams also have a proportion of jobs that came in within a certain benchmark, so that can be another mechanism, especially to deal with some of the hairiness of recruiting data when it comes to time. So that's one of the core metrics in terms of reporting.
And Miriam, I think if I'm not wrong, one of the things companies do when they look at time to fill is they have two different ways of evaluating. We've seen actually a lot of different ways, but two primary, right? One is there's a time to fill metric in itself. Another is a metric of the percentage of jobs that are filling within a certain SLA.
Yeah.
It's still related to time to fill.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about what a velocity metric here looks like, because one of the problems with time to fill is it's slow and it takes time to kind of get a real sense. And it has a massive impact on your capacity, but it's a very lagging indicator. And so I'm going to argue that the velocity metric here is what we call time to hire. And rather than start from the rec open date, you look at it from the candidate applied. So you take a successful candidate who got hired, and you look at when they applied to when they hired. So it's a true measure of how quickly you're moving a candidate through the funnel and focusing primarily on your successful candidates. And the goal here is it's a measure of candidate experience. It's a measure of recruiting productivity. And it's a little bit more, it's usually a quarter to 2 quarters faster than your time to fill. And one of the things that we're noticing is in this environment we're in, a lot of companies' time to fills have been stable because it's a longer metric, so it hides more. But time to hires are slowly starting to spike. We're taking longer to move candidates through the stage. And this is something that I'd say you got to pay a lot of attention to, because that quickly becomes a capacity problem 2 quarters from now. I'm curious if there are other time twos that you're using. Because there's so many time to metrics, and I want to talk a little bit about them. There's, just in our conversation, one of the problems with our industry is we don't have the standard definitions that if you look at sales and marketing and finance, the industry-wide standard definitions. In fact, we have a lot of different time to offers, time to fills, time to close. And each of them might be important depending on your organization. For example, if you're in an area where first day no-shows are a problem, time to start is more relevant than time to hire or time to fill, because you actually care if the candidate shows up. If you're in a high volume role where you have very little control over the post-offer process, maybe it's your high security role where you need to run very, very comprehensive background checks, then time to offer is a better metric. Somebody on the chat says we use time and stage. We're going to talk about that too, because that's a critical metric. And that is, I'm very glad you're thinking about time and stage as a metric to kind of move forward. So now we've talked about the overall persona. And I'm curious for the folks who are talking about time to hire and who use time to hire, if on the chat you could tell us a little bit about how has it been trending for you? Is it trending? The nice part is we're all anonymous thanks to this bug, so you can say it anonymously and we won't know who, without identifying who you are. But I'm kind of curious: is it stable? Is it trending up? Is it trending down? And are you thinking a lot about it? So with that, let's move to the next persona. Let's think about you as a recruiter or a recruiting leader. And what are you thinking about when you run this, when you think about recruiting effectiveness? And one of the classic metrics that we report on typically is rec load. So we say, on average, the historical rule of thumb has been look 4 to 5 recs for non-high volume roles. High volume roles in a quarter. For high volume roles, it can be a lot higher, especially if you're putting a rec out with a lot of positions. Now, one of the problems with that is we are in the process of trying to move capacity increases. And so you're trying to drive improvements in the quarterly rec load. So as a reporting metric, that's going to be already changing because of all the work you're doing. The question is, how do you make sure that it is changing at the speed that you want it to change? And so this is where I'm going to propose a velocity metric that if you're a recruiter, you should be paying a lot of attention to: time and stage, time and process. And so what is the average amount of time a candidate is spending in the major stages? And it's hard to look at this for all your candidates. I would argue, don't worry about candidates at like the application level or the screening level, but look at this for your candidates that are in the assessment interview, on-site, and look back in your recruiting ops meetings or in your intake meetings to say, how long are they spending on average at every stage? And I'd like to see this at 5 to 7. This is where, now one of the things we think about recruiting metrics is we think of them as metrics to measure recruiters. And this is a problem. This is something we have to change. Because recruiters are not the only folks responsible for a recruiting metric like time and stage. In fact, the number one bottleneck in time and stage is often the hiring manager conducting the interview or dispositioning the candidate or providing interview feedback and scheduling the next steps. And it often leaves our SLAs on the hook. That's some of the biggest challenges. And I'm going to ask you, I'm seeing some great commentary about rec load and about time to hire and time to fill. But I'm going to ask you in the audience another question, which is, are your hiring managers driving you bananas? And how do you deal with it? Do they? Couple of our customers have gone so far as to say, if a hiring manager doesn't respond to a rec in 2 or 3 days, we're going to freeze the rec. Now that's pretty draconian, but sometimes, we have to establish SLAs. And those SLAs have to be mutual. And on the chat, we'll also share a mutual SLA template that you can put in. But how do you get them? And so one of the things, by looking at this time and process metric, it's not about us thinking about just our metrics, but it's about bringing this to the attention of our hiring counterparts in real time and enforcing real-time accountability from the business in helping us achieve our recruiting goals, especially in a time where your recruiting capacity, as you're all saying, is massively stressed.
And I think the other part to sort of go back on is, like, if we think about the velocity metric for the overall, it's a time in it's a candidate focused time to hire focused area, right? And so if you break it down by the number of stages, and you've got like 10 sets of stages or 10 touch points, right? There's only so much you can do, and that's really important for bringing it up with your when you're talking to a hiring manager, is that, well, like, we've got all of these requirements. This is how long it's going to take. And if we budget X amount of time for major stages, it brings it back down into like the little nitpicky numbers of the amount of time it takes. And that can be an important point to bring up is, we may not have more people that we can throw at the problem, but maybe we want to restructure the recruiting process and to make it a little bit more streamlined, a lot less, turnovers, and try and consolidate as much as possible, which is both good from a candidate experience standpoint, but also, you can't invent new colleagues overnight or get them on your side to be able to, execute on your SLAs.
One of the great comments that I liked here was one user wrote in saying, the chances every day a candidate is in the process decreases the chances of them signing with us by 4%. So effectively, it's impacting offer acceptance rates, it's impacting candidate experience. And so I want to bring another metric that we brought in. And we ran through this in our last workshop, so I won't show you all the math, but a 13% increase in time to stage, a very, very small increase. So you think about this as less than 1 day on average increase in stage has a 30% impact on your capacity. And it really compounds. 20% starts to get a 60% increase in recruiter capacity. And I'm gonna, for the user who asked, in our last workshop, we showed you how the math breaks down. And so we'll reshare that. But that is really important, because this is one of the things we forget is, by not paying attention to this metric, is the volatility in this metric creates an enormous amount of stress in our capacity planning. So with that, let's get to the next idea. I'm going to bring in, we're going to now talk about, we're now going to talk about outbound effectiveness. Mariam, would you like to talk about the reporting metric for outbound effectiveness?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that when we think about outbound effectiveness, we're often thinking about early stage, how many of the outbound, like what is the effort that it takes to source an outbound hire. And so we usually measure it in the same way that we do with RecLoad, with a number of outbound hires per quarter for each sourcer. We know that this can vary depending on whether you have specialist sources that are 100% focused on sourcing in terms of the benchmark versus people who are more generalist recruiters. And the best sort of example of a velocity metric that we would recommend here is really focusing on early stage pass-through, because one of the problems with looking at the proportion of outbound hires is that, you need to wait for the quarter to finish to be able to measure that value. But we can get much earlier signal from looking at the proportion of outbound hires that are screened divided by the number of them being as candidates. And we're going to do outbound first and then cover inbound, but you will see that we have different expectations of these because, when you're screening candidates or you're inviting them to join, you've done some level of pre-screening almost. And so your outbound rates should be much higher just because they're a much more high touch process, and their conversion rates should be higher as well.
And it's so expensive to do sourcing. It is so much work. And too often when I'm looking at metrics of companies, I'm finding that sourcing effectiveness has dramatically changed, not across the board, but maybe in some areas. In some areas, these last few quarters, candidates are getting spammed with a lot more AI generated messages. They're getting inundated on LinkedIn. Everyone started to use a lot of the same strategies. And because we're not tracking these metrics in real time, we are starting to put a lot of effort and taking up a lot of our capacity without getting the yield that we deserve to get from it. That we can maybe use that capacity differently. The other problem that's happening is a lot of companies have developed very deep sourcing bench. And one of the things that we talked about in our labor market update was we're moving a lot of our organizations from sort of deep specialist sourcing to sometimes more generalist recruiting. And it's a lot harder to get the same level of yield through generalist recruiting than you get from specialist sourcing. So you've got to think about those metrics and think about the resource allocation a little bit differently with that.
And I think the other thing to sort of highlight here, and the reason why this is a really good early stage metric, is that hiring is a team sport, like we said. And so if your hiring managers are sort of not interested in who is coming to you and who they want to take to the next stage of screening, then that's usually a good marker of lack of alignment. And you don't want to wait till the end of the quarter until you're aware of that lack of alignment, or wait till you get to later stages in the process. So this is a really good diagnostic tool from an early stage to understand, was this a freak, or is it something that's more systematic in this case?
In fact, it reminds me of one of the other pieces of data that Miriam, you had put out years ago, which was that almost 40% of recs fail. And they fail oftentimes at that very kickoff meeting. That intake meeting is the most critical meeting you do, because it determines how effective. If your hiring manager is truly partnering with you, then you've got a mechanism to understand, how do I build a strategy to source for this role, to find, and then these metrics make sense. And then the hiring manager is invested and you're both working together to drive success. So often, recruiting, when 30% of your recs fail, it sucks up an enormous amount of your recruiting capacity for something that often gets solved there. And so when you think about the interventions, sometimes the intervention, you look at a metric like the outbound sourcing pass rate, you see it drop and you're like, oh, we're not doing sourcing effectively. Sometimes the intervention is, no, we're not doing the kickoff meeting effectively. And we have to actually get to the kickoff and align there rather than just be focused on finding the place to blame. Somebody asked, how do you define fail? We define fail in two ways. They didn't achieve a hire within your SLA. So if you have an SLA of 60 days time to fail, they just didn't get there. But also many recs, a substantial portion of recs just get shut down. And they get shut down because we gave up. We gave up on hiring it. It took so long. We moved on to something else. We looked at resourcing it differently. But it still took us a lot of effort in doing all the effort of hiring without the success of actually getting a hire. So let's talk inbound. Before we get to inbound, I have a question for all of you. Are you dealing with candidate starvation or abundance or both? Because we're in a weird environment. Some roles are getting hundreds, thousands of applicants on LinkedIn and Indeed. Some roles don't get enough. And so what part are you dealing with? By the way, somebody says our ATS just captures an applicant decline, but we don't get detailed answers. That's something we should talk about and see if the drop-off report would be helpful here, and I'm sure to show you that. So the answer, some folks are saying over both, not surprised. I think that's the common thing that's happening here. And this is one of the differences. It's remote and hybrid, as we talked about, just getting an enormous number of candidates and getting a lot of one-click applies. If I can give you one tip, shorten your jobs. Shorten your jobs. For every 100 words, you decrease the quality of your applicant pool substantially. And so shorten your jobs. So now let's talk a little bit about recruitment marketing and inbound hiring. a lot of you have recruitment marketing functions, but if you don't, chances are you still think about this as recruiting leaders, as recruiting ops professionals, as even as recruiters. And one of the metrics that you should look at, that is classic metric to look at, is the proportion of inbound hires, right? We like to see, even for highly specialized roles, roughly 50% of your hiring should still be inbound. In today's market especially, it used to be 25% and like 21, 22. But in today's market, it should be 50. But less specialized roles, higher volume roles, you should be 75, maybe even 90% should be inbound. Your candidate should be coming to you because outbound is expensive. It's effort. We should be focused on that. But one of the problems with just looking at the proportion of hires is it's a noisy metric. You might be using referrals, you might be using internal hiring. And so the proportion of hiring sometimes changes. And so the velocity metric that I would use to measure recruitment marketing and your effectiveness specifically is the screening pass-through rate by inbound source. So look at your key channels, whether it's a careers page, LinkedIn, Indeed, and specifically look at how many candidates are passing through the phone screens, getting to the phone screen stage, passing through application review. You're deeming them qualified enough. Because this is a metric where you're seeing a lot of volatility. Now, if you're seeing, despite the overabundance, 10, 12, 13% of those folks are making it through, great. Then it's still better to focus on that rather than sourcing. If you start to see that fall to 2, 3%, as you're seeing in some parts, then you've got to start to think about, is our capacity better spent in that inbound funnel? Is it spent in other ways? But it's also, should we change our mix shift to get the right recruitment marketing pieces here? And so I want to one thing that we spent one of the things that's happened is there's been an enormous number of algorithmic changes that Indeed and LinkedIn have put through in the last year. They put hashtags, they put specific guidance around paid transparency, they've got specific guidance around the way they want titles to be organized. These things massively impact visibility, impacts the quality of your jobs, impacts if you're dealing with starvation and dealing with overabundance. And we put a cheat sheet and a free guide together, and we'll share it here in the chat as well. But this is something to pay real attention to, because sometimes it feels like the market has shifted when it isn't the market that shifted, it's the algorithms that have shifted. And we've got to react to those algorithms and react to our recruitment marketing strategy that drives that. Now, a user asks, can you share the stat again? Every 100 words, your job description is less effective. Yes. When your jobs especially go well beyond 600 words, many jobs do, sometimes we're writing tomes. What we've found is you can get up to 70% lower quality in candidate pools than short, concise roles. In fact, we did some work, as well as on LinkedIn put out some studies that showed sort of an eyeball tracking of how candidates look at jobs. And candidates spend the same amount of time looking at your jobs that you spend looking at their resumes, 7 to 10 seconds. And they quickly gravitate to the key points. And when you're putting out internal job profiles instead of job ads, when you're writing these really long jobs, it dramatically lowers the quality. People still apply, because one-click apply makes that happen, especially if the role is remote. But the number of people applying who've actually reviewed your role carefully is a lot less. And that just clogs up your funnels. And that's what we want to try to avoid. So now let's talk. One of the big things we talked about is location matters. In fact, a few years ago, hybrid behaved a lot like on-site. People, there's a lot of focus on remote. But one of the things that's changed is hybrid roles are starting to get 100 plus, sometimes 200 applicants. They're starting to behave a little bit more like remote jobs. But there's a lot of confusion about what hybrid is. Is it 3 days a week? Is it 4 days a week? And there's a lot of lack of clarity about what hybrid is. And what we found is if you're dealing with low quality, overabundance, look at a couple of things. Look at your hashtags, look at your LinkedIn, look at the way you're defining the role. Are you being very clear about it? So it's not, you don't want the search algorithms to accidentally classify your job as remote or hybrid when it's not. And the second is, are you clear about those location requirements in the title? Not only will this improve your quality of candidates, it'll massively improve candidate experience. The number one complaint we hear from candidates today is, I wish these jobs would just tell us what they mean when they say it's hybrid. Like, we're guessing, and that creates all sorts of downstream problems in terms of drop-off rates, in terms of offer acceptance rates, and we can all save ourselves time by just having a single sentence that is very clear about what our location requirements for a job are. And if your hiring managers are not giving you clarity, that's where the intake meeting is critical. Do not let them dodge the question.
And I think there are two parts to that. One is, the candidate experience side of it, where candidates feel bait and switched by very unclear restrictions. But also, you don't want to screen through people who have no intention of moving to the geo, that you need that as a requirement, for various contexts that then a candidate's not aware of. So being really clear and not necessarily using internal jargon that might not make sense to an external candidate is really helpful on both sides, where you also reduce some noise that comes in from being ambiguous about the location requirements.
One great question that came in is, what if the job could be remote, hybrid, or in office, Mariam? What do you think?
So if you're open to remote, then remote, but you would track it as remote. But because that opens up your candidate pool, you're not geographically restricted. And the place to communicate that level of flexibility is, during the screening call, to sort of say, look, we do have you can come in office, but we do support remote work if you truly support remote work. If it's not truly supporting remote work and you would prefer to have people in office on some level, then you should describe it as hybrid, because I think that's probably much more appropriate.
Sometimes jobs are work from home, but they're not remote. Like, you still want them in Chicago or New York or a specific city. Call those jobs hybrid and be specific about that. There's not a requirement to come into the office every day, but we do require this person to be in this city, and therefore this is a hybrid role. Now, let's talk about talent attraction. We have two more to go, and those are both very critical. One of the problems with employer brand, and one of the opportunities in employer brand, is it's always felt like a touchy-feely part, just like marketing brand has been. But it is so critical. I'd argue if there's no more critical piece today, no bigger unlock you can have than thinking about your employer brand. And the reason is, the employer brand is a way you influence your pass-through rates, the quality of candidates coming through, that make it through the funnel, that make it through all the way, and that ripples into everything. It ripples into offer acceptance, it ripples into time to hire, ripples into time to fill. Employer brand can often be an impact for a large organization that saves you millions and millions of dollars. But pass-through rates are very variable, especially in this time where on-site and remote is is shifting. Some of you are going RTO. You're going to see huge volatility in these numbers. And so how do you think about employer brand as a forward-thinking metric? And the metric that we want to propose to you is the average or median number of candidates that make it to the last stage of your hiring process, your on-site interview, your assessment stage, that stage. And what we've seen is when you get 5+ candidates at that stage, you're very likely to be able to make that offer. If you get 2 or 3, you might make an offer, but now if that offer doesn't get accepted, you might have to go back and start from scratch on the process. And so the failure rate of the recs goes high, the amount of time sunk in failed recs goes high, your capacity gets massively impacted. So the metric that you should be really thinking about is, how do we get 5+ candidates to the assessment stage for hire? And this is where investing in your employer brand can pay massive dividends, because if it brings this up to 5+ with more regularity, if you're able to get 10% better in your rec completion rates within your SLA, that can often mean, for a large organization, millions of dollars in agency costs, sourcing costs. It can mean much better recruiting capacity. So in this specific moment we're in, this is almost the unintuitive bet. We see companies making this investment, and we see this actually having an enormous amount of dividends. And I'm going to point out 2 things. This is a big unlock for productivity. And the one thing that we don't think about when we think about sort of employer brand is that oftentimes people think about the employer brand, they think about the flashy careers page, and that's really important, about the blog. But the one thing is, for the average company, more people see your jobs on than see your company's website. Because today your jobs get syndicated everywhere. They get put automatically, they get scraped, they get crawled, they get put on Indeed, they get put on LinkedIn, they get put on Glassdoor, they get put everywhere. And that is often the first interaction that your brand is having with the candidate. And it's so critical that interaction be a good one. It's be a complete one and be an effective one. And so this is, in my mind, one of the biggest unlocks for your productivity today. Now, Mariam, I'm going to turn it to you, and we're going to talk a little bit about measuring fairness and representations. Who should care about this?
Right. So I think everyone should think about this. I know many of us, at least who are based in the US, are sort of going through this re-envisioning of these functions. And I think it's incumbent on everyone within the TA function to consider how critical it is. We know what are the business benefits of representation. And I think that businesses that do better are going to have more representative candidates and hires. And so one of the common things that people do when they're looking at reporting metric, again, is to look at the proportion of hires from different backgrounds. And that can vary depending on, there's no benchmark here because it does vary depending on which locations you're hiring and what type of jobs. And for some teams, especially they're looking at senior hires for different demographic groups. And the velocity metric that I would recommend showing or focusing on is a little bit earlier in the process, because especially when we're looking at the whole hiring process, again, it's a quarter out from what you would be looking at. And so looking at the proportion of the pass-through rate of different demographic groups is really important and helpful. Ideally, earlier stage, because it's one of those areas where we want to be able to capture it early. And we want to see both the proportion be sort of similar across different demographic groups to show fairness at play, but also that we want to see the raw numbers at like screening and assessment at showing that representation as well. So let me move on in terms of, I think we have a couple more components, right, Amit? So this is yeah, go ahead.
We're going to bring this. So this is a summary that we wanted to put together, and we're going to share a cheat sheet with you as to how, as our recommendation is, this is still a lot of metrics, but at any given moment of time, somebody in your org is wearing one of these hats. And our recommendation is align each of them on one velocity metric, the metric that we think can drive and influence a reporting metric in the future. You're still going to have to report on your choice of reporting metrics. But if we can get to be more real time about this, we think there's significant capacity unlocks in your metrics that we can unlock, or significant bottlenecks. These allow you to look around the curves. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to showing you a short demo. And I want to show you specifically, how do we diagnose a typical, how could we diagnose a recruiting process in less than 2 minutes? And how could we identify potential areas for digging in and for interventions? So I'm going to turn to the other screen. Aaron, could you connect to my other screen? Wonderful. So this is the Data People platform. Now, if you're a customer and you don't have access to this, it might be because we haven't integrated our ATSs yet. We can talk about that with your customer rep. And if you're not a customer yet, but you probably still have access to this type of data in some form through your ATS, through a BI dashboard. So today's point is not really, we're not trying to sell the platform as much. We want to sort of walk through how you run a diagnostic. And I wanted to show you that. And I'm kind of curious if you've got ideas on how you run this diagnostic differently as you go through this, or challenge me. So I start with an executive insights dashboard, which has all of my core metrics. And for this company, you'll notice, they're getting a lot of applications. I'm looking at the last quarter, Q4 of last year. And the first thing I want to sort of pay attention to is these top panels. 0.7% overall pass-through rate. I know this company is a mix of remote and hybrid. 0.7% today is right in that mix. What it means is roughly 130 to 150 applicants per hire. That sounds fine. It's not overwhelming, but it's also not anemic. But what I get concerned about is this company has taken 60 days to hire a candidate. So time to hire, as you remember, is applicant hire to applicant. I think that is going to be a problem, and that's well above our benchmarks. It also has, and I'm not surprised when you have a time to hire this high, chances are you have a low offer acceptance rate. You see, and you have a drop-off rate. These are correlated metrics. When you have time to hire this high, it shows that you've got a candidate experience problem, and that typically also exacerbates your offer acceptance rates and your drop-off rates. I would like to see the offer acceptance rate be 85+%. Now, there's a counterintuitive point. I'm going to ask Mariam for her opinion here. What if my offer acceptance rate was 90%, Mariam? Would you be happy about that? 90, 95%? Should we go as high as possible? I think you muted.
I'm sorry, I was typing. No, because I think often it means that we're aiming too low. And so there needs to be some healthy tension in terms of the offer acceptance rate. Like, you do want to be competitive, but it's possible that you're competing in the wrong ways, or you're misleveling jobs, or or some combination of other things.
One of the biggest pitfalls for talent acquisition is letting offer acceptance rate rise too high in times like this. So the market, there's a higher likelihood of candidates accepting your offer. And we make the mistake sometimes of letting that offer acceptance rate go to 90, 95%. And I'd say, no, don't do it. It sets an unreasonable benchmark. When the market gets hard again, you have to live up to that 90, 95% benchmark. Your capacity planning is on it. No. But also, this is a chance for you to then reevaluate your requirements to see if you can hire slightly more senior candidates, if you can sort of rethink some of your bands. This is our unique opportunity to bring some efficiency in. So I like to see offer acceptance rates see very stable rather than go high. But I do get really concerned when I see drop-off rates. Again, as an executive level, I'm just going to quickly think about the diagnostic. This is a tech company-ish, half tech, half non. And so they started about 40% gender distribution, and they kind of leveled it up. That's great. We're starting to see good fairness, good representation. And you're seeing more than 50% of hires come from inbound. And you're seeing a diversity of different sources. So at the face of it, this looks like a relatively healthy recruitment marketing, relatively healthy in terms of talent attraction, but some worries in terms of process and candidate experience. And that's what I want to dig into. So I'm going to dig into then, the first thing I'm going to dig into when I see a diagnostic like this is I want to dig into drop-offs. And I want to understand where those drop-offs are happening. Because it's very different if drop-offs happen at the application stage versus at later stages. And when I go into the drop-offs, I'm like, wow. I see the drop-offs, I see 20% drop-offs at the assessment stage. 1 in 5 candidates that you're bringing so painstakingly into the later stages of your process are saying, no, thank you. Chances are they're saying it because you're keeping them waiting very long. But I would like to see this number well below 10%. This is where we start to get, there's a candidate experience problem. This also then results in them writing stuff about us on Glassdoor and and those review sites. And it just ripples. And the more we can control this number, the better it is for candidate experience and for employer brand. And one of the things I like to do is dig into usually it's a department or team that drives that. One great question that we're seeing here is, are folks still focused on internal mobility? I'd love for all of you in the audience to answer that. From what I've seen is, I think that we've seen an increase in internal mobility focus in the last few years as we're starting to see both a maturation of that idea, but also as we're starting to see wanting to kind of reallocate resources and skills in the right way. We then look into the overall report. And I like to look at the overall report to see where my mix shift is coming and where my overall screening rate's coming through. And what I'm really happy to see when I look at this diagnostic is the inbound pass-through rate. So 13% of candidates are moving from applied to screening. That's excellent right now. Anything north of 10, you should celebrate, especially if your roles are non-high volume, non-on-site roles. And this company has a mix. Outbound is also very good. It's great to see that the efforts they're putting in sourcing actually result in a qualified candidate pool downstream and results in hires. So they're putting in the right amount of effort. They're seeing some internal. We're seeing a decent amount in referrals. One other problem with referrals that you should be wary of is referrals is another thing that was a drug that we kind of got used to in 21, 22 when inbound was really challenging, but it hasn't always the same effectiveness. So if you've got like very big referral bonuses, that can also create adverse incentives and create skews in your pipeline. But I want to dig into inbound more.
And I think
outbound.
Just to back that up, there's two sort of little factoids that I would add to that. One is, referrals tend to come from the same populations as, like we know that referrals tend to come from the same populations as your current workers. So they're not technically or usually used to, influence fairness. And so that's one part of it. And secondly, I know a lot of recruiters who actually hate referrals because they feel like they have to add people to screening and assessment because they came in through a referral because they're trying to keep the peace internally. And that can create like a very adverse incentive. So pulling back on referral bonuses and referral systems can be really helpful just from a process standpoint. So you're not, doing favors for different teammates because you have had to maintain the peace.
Referrals are like the dual-edged sword that we all grapple with.
Yeah.
Let's look into now the inbound and the outbound, because this is one of the areas where I want to focus on. Chances are you have a mix of different sources. And so when I look at overall inbound, I'm like 13.5% recruitment marketing, pat on the back, you're doing a good job, you're bringing the candidates in. But you can still see that with your average company, you might have some shifts, some differences in the effectiveness of your different sources. Either they're not bringing enough volume or they're not bringing enough quality. Like for this company, I'd pay attention to LinkedIn Sponsored. If LinkedIn Sponsored isn't driving the quality I want to see, that's a problem. And maybe I don't need to sponsor as much. And by the way, I don't mean this as LinkedIn Sponsored doesn't work in general. It absolutely works. But every geo is different. Every type of job is different. And so you've got to make sure it works for you. It's optimized for you and your marketing. Similarly, Glassdoor, it is an excellent source for many folks, but in this case, it doesn't work. It's not working. And I would turn off investment and resources and also turn off applications from these lower quality sources from clogging up your funnels because it just drains your capacity. Similarly, I'd look at outbound. In the outbound effectiveness for this company is really good. I can see that not all the channels that your recruiters spend time on are the same. Some of the channels are just not providing you the yield, either in volume or in effectiveness that you'd want to see. And I'd want to see that turned off. I'd want to see us use our scarce resources where they're most valuable. Finally, I'm going to look at two other reports. I'm going to look at a gender diagnostic, and I want to look at it at every stage in the funnel. And one of the nice things I see in this funnel is, in general, there's equity and parity at every stage. The one thing I worry about is the difference between female offer acceptance rate and male offer acceptance rate. And this is something you dive into because your overall offer acceptance rate is low too, but it's especially low for women. And why is that? And this might be as simple as, something in the assessment stage, something in a specific department. I'd want to dig in and get to the bottom of it and make sure I'm that's the parity that we should be accomplishing in our organization. And then finally, if you're a recruiter and you're running your team or you're a recruiting ops leader, I'd want to dig into an individual rec. I'd want to have reports for each of my recs. And I'd want to know for that rec, the candidate pools, how diverse they are. And I'd want to see where the candidates are on the stage and how long they're spending in stages. Because if you're seeing your hiring managers don't wait 6 months later to tell them. We want to tell them right away. We want to, ideally send them a note and say, hang on, hiring manager. In this case, it's Mariam. I'm going to blame her for it. Please interview these candidates now. Too often I'm finding that we're waiting for our QBRs with the hiring managers of the teams to let them know about their responsibilities, to remind them of their responsibilities to our SLAs. And we've got to forge the partnerships. Now, one user asked, does everyone have access to the ATS gender? We would love to have a conversation. It should be locked down. Now, one thing about our gender report is very often diversity data is survey driven. and surveys are not always complete. And so our models are inference models. They're not meant to tell you that Mariam's a female or Amit's a male. But what they're meant to tell you is with a 95% confidence, where is my funnel trending, and give you a directional sense of where you've got potential fairness bottlenecks. Happy to work with you on how we can drive that. And our goal ultimately is to drive the fairness in your process across the board. So that was like a quick 30-second, couple of minutes sort of view on how you can run a quick diagnostic, and you should be running it with some frequency. And as I said, every team or every hat you wear, you should focus on a different metric. We have a couple of minutes left. I want to ask any questions, any thoughts, any observations from any of you. I have to say, thank you for such amazing engagement and such amazing sharing of great ideas on this. It's really fantastic. So one question is, I'm curious how everyone will track DEI with everything happening in our administration. Funny you ask. In 3 weeks, on March 5th, we are running a workshop. On March 6th, we are running a workshop on how, firstly, DEI is not dead, but how DEI is transforming, and it's critical to things like candidate experience, fairness, that we all care about. It's critical to fundamental hiring goals. We're going to bring some experts on. We're going to talk about metrics you can use, tactical tips you can use, and also how you reframe parts of these problems internally. So I hope you'll join us for that, because I think that's going to be a really fun conversation and a really important and timely conversation as well. We're tracking these questions on the chat, but thank you all for your engagement. And thank you, Mariam, for joining me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Those were great comments. I couldn't believe how much useful information we got from them.
If you'd like to dive into any of this specifically for you, I'm going to put my email in the chat or add me on LinkedIn. We'd love to engage, would love to spend time, whether you're a customer or somebody who's heard about us and joining us for the first time, would love to sort of dive into any of this deeply with you. But thank you so much, and have a wonderful week, everyone.